who has had cancer, maybe a mother, a sister, father, something like that, we already should know that it's important that we are very wary of things that could be triggers for cancer. But this does not mean that once people have been diagnosed, there's nothing we can do to help. So we shall speak first about the things that maybe we need to know in order to reduce our risk profile. And then we'll go on to speak about the products and how we can recommend them for people who have already been diagnosed. So to start with, normal cells in our bodies have got a specific kind of life cycle in which they grow, they divide, and as they age, they die. So this information is contained in the DNA of the cell, that the cell is going to be instructed how much it needs to grow before it divides, and then how long it's going to live before it dies of age. Cancer cells, however, instead of dying as a result of aging, they divide to form abnormal cells. So normal cells when normal cells become cancerous, there usually is a trigger. And the trigger can act by damaging the DNA. And remember, the DNA is like the instruction manual for the cell. So once it is damaged, then it means that the cell can malfunction. However, this does not mean that if the DNA in a cell is damaged, it straightforwardly leads to cancer. No, many of the cells will repair themselves and go on living. Others will die of their own accord if the repair is not possible. But then some will become rogue, and what they will do is then start not following the instruction manual, and they start dividing. They do not perform the function of the tissue to which they belong. And of course, then they become what we call tumors, and some of the tumors are cancerous. So tumors simply refers to abnormal growth, but some of the tumors will be benign, which means they are not cancerous, while others are going to be cancerous. So let us look at some of the things that act as triggers, because I've mentioned that for normal cells to become cancerous, there usually is a trigger. So what are the triggers that cause a normal cell to start behaving differently from how it is supposed to behave? So there are many unknown triggers, but there are a few which are known, which research has shown categorically that they are triggers for cancer. And there are some I'm sure that you are aware of. For example, nicotine from tobacco smoke. This knowledge is well established that nicotine is a carcinogenic substance, which means that we should avoid, or if we are smokers, we should do our best to quit smoking. If we have maybe a family member or an environment where there is cigarette smoking, we should do what we can to mitigate against that problem, because you do not necessarily have to be the one who is a smoker in order to be triggered by the tobacco, if the nicotine in the cigarettes that can act as a trigger. And of course, we know that much legislation has been done to exclude smoking from public places so that we minimize the exposure to this carcinogen. But of course, in our private homes, there may be someone who is smoking. And if they are not yet maybe ready to give up smoking, it would be an act of kindness to possibly smoke where they do not expose anyone to secondary smoke. So that is the first one. Another trigger that is well established is obesity. So obesity is actually a known cancer trigger, and it is thought that it is not actually the fat itself, but the metabolic problems that lead to us becoming fat. And those metabolic problems have been put under the name of metabolic syndromes. So there are a group of symptoms that are associated with obesity, and these symptoms are also have been found to increase our cancer risk. So what are some of the metabolic problems that lead to obesity and are therefore linked to cancer? The first is the depositing of fat on the waistline. So that is abdominal fat. I think we often speak about this. So abdominal fat is the most dangerous fat because we have mentioned before that it is associated with many serious illnesses. And here is another one. So the next, abdominal fat, fat that is under the skin or deposited in the hips, is not as dangerous as fat that is deposited on the abdomen. So if as time goes by, maybe, and unfortunately these days we see even small children with enlarged waistlines, it means that they're already showing signs of metabolic syndrome. Then the next sign of metabolic syndrome is high blood pressure, another illness which has become so common that it is almost considered part of a lifestyle, and people simply go on taking medication day in, day out. But the problem is that this high blood pressure is doing its damage even as we are taking the medicine and life is going on. So the best thing is to actually opt for ways to cure the high blood pressure and normalize blood pressure. Then the next one is high fasting blood sugar. This is where if you test your blood sugar after you have not been eating for a specific period of time, the blood sugar is still high. That is another sign of metabolic syndrome. And it means that either the person is pre-diabetic or diabetic. Then the fourth sign of metabolic syndrome is high fats in the blood, or you may hear them referred to as high triglycerides. This is another sign of metabolic syndrome. And then low amounts of good cholesterol and high amounts of the harmful cholesterol. That is another sign. So a quick way to determine whether the fat around our abdomen is reaching a stage where we should be seriously concerned is if the circumference measurement of our waist is more than half that of our height. So the waistline maximum should be half of the height of a person. Once that figure starts changing so that our waistline becomes higher and higher than half of our height, then it means that we are depositing that dangerous fat and we should take measures. We shall mention a few of them now, but we shall mention them maybe in a specific session dealing with metabolic health. So obesity, therefore, and metabolic syndrome, which is what leads to obesity and is associated with obesity, is the next trigger of cancer. Then the third trigger are certain disease-causing microbes which increase the risk of certain cancers. So, for example, herpes can increase the risk of cervical cancer. Hepatitis B virus can increase the risk of liver cancer. And H. pylori can increase the risk of stomach cancer. So periodically, I get questions about things like H. pylori and the hepatitis viruses. And we have got maybe ways in which we can help people to get rid of this. Some of them we can get rid of, others we cannot. But just to be aware that if we have been diagnosed with any of these, either herpes, or hepatitis B virus or H. pylori, then it could be one of the things that have been found to be triggers of certain types of cancer, as I've listed there. Certain chemicals also that we might be exposed to are triggers of cancer. These are things like lead. Lead, remember, is a metal that in olden days used to be used for water pipes, but it was found that actually it is very harmful, and so the use of lead in water pipes was stopped. It was also used in paints, but these days I think that has stopped because of this exact problem. Another substance that maybe some of the older people might remember is asbestos. So asbestos fibers used to be the cause of cancer, especially for people who are working with asbestos. Other chemicals are a heavy use of alcohol has also been linked as a trigger of cancer. And then habitually eating processed meats. So processed meats specific types of cured meat. So, for example, salami, polony, ham, bacon. These ones are cured meats, and the chemicals that are used for curing them have been found to be triggers for certain types of cancer. But remember also that a trigger does not work the same in everybody. Some people may not find that their cells react immediately. But since these have been established, or the last one I should have mentioned there is repetitive exposure to high radiation. So this is not the minor radiation that you get in an X-ray, things like that, but higher ones. So it is good to know if you are going to be exposed to radiation, whether it is a safe amount or not. So all these triggers, I would just like to say, are have been well established by research that they are linked to cancer as triggers. So remember, we all have cells, and since we have cells, it is possible that we might be one of the person who is triggered and get cancer from these triggers. However, it does not mean that because I've mentioned this, we should now be paranoid. It's just that we need to be aware, especially in areas where there is something that we can do to avoid or work or mitigate for our exposure. So then I also wanted to go on to say that what the trigger does, whatever the trigger is, what it does is that it leads to oxidative stress. That is an accumulation of byproducts of cellular activities. And this accumulation is such that our systems are not able to keep up with detoxing them, which means that a single exposure or a once in a while exposure is unlikely to, not impossible, but is unlikely to cause us harm. However, repeated or chronic exposure increases the chances that a problem is going to occur. So, such accumulated byproducts, what they do is that they damage cellular processes, and they can also damage the DNA. And remember, I said just now that when the DNA is damaged, then one of the things that can happen is that the cell can then start behaving in an abnormal way. Of course, as I said, the cell might repair itself or the cell might die. But the third option is that the cell might go rogue and start dividing in an uncontrolled way. So normally cancer triggers have to be chronic or repetitive in order to exert their carcinogenic effects. Then the next section, before I go to that, I just wanted to mention that in the 1950s, that is maybe less than 80 years ago, Western researchers thought that Africans were actually immune to certain kinds of cancer. And that means that some of this large increase in the number of cancer cases has got to be in one way or another linked to the change in our diet and in our culture and in our lifestyle. So if there was a time in which some of these cancers were so rare, and yet now they are becoming more and more common, and I can say for sure that this is so because as the time has passed by, questions to do with cancer have increased, just as questions to do with diabetes and high blood pressure have increased, which tells us that there is a link between this high increase with something that is changing in our environment. And it is not our genetics, it's more likely to be something in our diet or something in our lifestyle. So what can we do to mitigate against these triggers that can put us in harm's way? The first is to be informed and avoid the known triggers. There are triggers that we do not know, and therefore there is nothing we can do about that. But there are some, as the ones which I've listed for you above, that are now known and established as triggers of cancer. We should therefore make the effort to remove them from our lives so as to reduce our risk profile. In addition to that, there are certain foods that are closely linked to ill health and things like metabolic syndrome. So we know that things like sugar, refined sugar that is added to very many different foods and drinks that we have now, has been linked with metabolic syndrome and therefore with obesity and cancer. Refined carbohydrates, especially excessively refined carbohydrates, and then factory oils, the oils that are manufactured from seeds which are processed in factories to make oils. All these are associated with oxidative stress. And as I've said, oxidative stress is one of the ways in which cancer triggers causes damage to our DNA. And that damaged DNA is what can, in some cases, cause the cell to start behaving abnormally and leading to the formation of tumors. So for that reason, it means that we opting for healthy dietary choices as well as a healthy lifestyle is an important part of mitigating against cancer. And that means that we should, as far as possible, opt for good protein. So for example, fish, wild fish as far as possible, traditional meats like chicken and animals that are raised in their more natural way, because, unfortunately today our food has been tampered with in very many ways. I think that fortunately for us in Africa, there are still many opportunities for us to find foods that have been minimally tampered with. So as far as possible, that should be the option we should take. Then in terms of our carbohydrates, carbohydrates are one of the food groups that causes enlargement, fat deposits in our abdomen. So we should be careful about the type of carbohydrates that we opt for. Should opt for maybe things like legumes, roots, and tubers, and minimally processed traditional grains. And this means that, for instance, where we can eat the grain as a whole thing, it is better than when it is milled and put in a packet. So when we speak about processing, our foods are always processed to one degree or another, because the term processing can even be referring to something like getting the maize out of the cob, threshing it, and putting it in a sack. But that is what is referred to as minimal threshing, because it's simply harvesting the grain and bringing it in. That when we go on to the next step of grinding it, that means we have taken the processing one step further. When we go on to make it into a food that has got colorants, preservatives, and then it is packaged, then we have gone to now the excessively processed or ultra processed. If we think about the oils, if we take something like a maize grain and then it is crushed and chemically processed in order to extract oil from it, by the time we are using that oil, too much processing has taken place to that maize grain. And if we compare it to the maize grain that we got from the field, it is now an ultra processed product when we take it as an oil. So this is just to say that we should look at our food and see that we avoid foods that have had too much done to it, because unfortunately, the more things that are done to foods in our modern culture, the more likely it is to be problematic to us. Originally, processing was simply supposed to make the food more palatable and easier to transport and so on. But more and more other issues have come into play. And so for that reason, we really do need to look at what we are eating. And as far as possible, eat the foods that our cultural ancestors ate, so that we avoid some of the illnesses that are now creeping into ourselves and causing this very dangerous diagnosis. So then let us now turn our attention to the Neolife supplements that we can recommend.